That question, like many other challenges to my standing in the Nexian public eye, hit me with the courtesy of a purposeful door slam to the hand. Being put on the spot, having all eyes suddenly turning on me after what seemed to be a smooth transition into the motions of class, was completely and utterly debilitating. Or at least, it would have been, if it wasn't for the armor acting as a very real barrier that I can now use as a crutch to escape the throes of social awkwardness. Moreover, PSYOP training, as gruesome as it was now paying its dividends as I deftly shifted my focus quickly from shock and embarrassment to finding solutions to that unexpected challenge. Is education a prerequisite for the use of magic? I parroted the man's question within my helmet, my speakers on mute, as I mulled over the intricacies of the question for a few short seconds. On one hand, it was an impossible question to answer with any degree of confidence, without the appropriate prerequisite knowledge. On the other hand, it was as straightforward a question as could be. If I decided to put my thinking cap on and apply my situational adaptability and personal initiative skills to the test once more. No, Professor, I responded confidently. I wouldn't say education is a prerequisite for magic, just as education is not strictly a prerequisite for the application of any force of nature, I quickly added. Because just as one can arbitrarily strike two rocks together to create a spark to ignite some kindling, so too can one arbitrarily feel the ebbs and flows of mana in the mana streams, channeling it to perform spells and magic to physical effect. But it's education, and the establishment of systems of learning and the institutions which facilitate it, that separates arbitrary practices from learned intent. Which is what unlocks the potential for a civilization to move from intuitive understanding to reason and knowledge-based understanding, granting it the ability to maximize and iterate upon what would otherwise be actions without deliberate intent. Because whilst both paths offer the same ends at first, it's the second path, the path of actually comprehending the reason behind the process, that separates a lifetime of striking two rocks together from the creation of flint and steel. I just about channeled every disparate and formerly unrelated region of my brain in order to reach that conclusion. Having more or less pulled from the impromptu ad-libbing of castles and wyverns roleplays, the public speaking skills from PSYOP speech classes, the recent knowledge of mana and mana streams gained from Thasia and the gang, as well as even some vague pointers from science class at one point. All of these seemingly random elements came to form an unholy answer that felt like it had been more at home in some really esoteric Castles and Wyverns campaign. Yet despite that, and despite how I was flying by the seat of my pants here, what mattered most was how that answer was received. And given Vanavan's genuinely wide-eyed expression, and the various glares, stares, and gawks from the rest of the student body, I could tell it at least made an impression, if not an unexpected one. "That is categorically accurate, Cadet Emma Booker," Vanavan replied in no uncertain terms, a certain degree of disbelief colouring what was in effect a voice that harboured a similar praising tone he'd used with Quiv not a moment earlier. "If this wisdom is truly of your own making, derived exclusively from your realm's teachings, then I can foresee a very fruitful year to come of our classes." The man paused for a moment, as if pondering his next few words carefully, the ponderings of which, for some reason, seemed to put the teacher's pet, Quiv, on high alert, if his hawkish eyes were of any indication. 15 points to the new realmer and her peer group, and to whichever house she finds herself in by week's end," the man finally announced, eliciting a drastic shift in the class's atmosphere, as gasps belonging to wildly different species punctuated the air, complementing the shock in Quiv's eyes, which transitioned almost immediately to a ferocious side-eye of competitive aggression directed towards me and me alone. A sole second was all it took for that side-eye to develop into the raising of an arm, except it wasn't Quiv whose arm was being raised this time around. Instead, it was a certain bull who sat a few rows over, his eyes absolutely welling with a hatred that far outpaced Quiv's, which, unsurprisingly, was received all but graciously by the blue-robed professor. "Yes, Lord Ping."
"Your acknowledgement of the New Realmer's answer is an insult to the very institutions of magic, Professor Vanavan."
The bull spoke in no uncertain terms. His eyes, however, clearly weren't trained on the professor himself, but me. As if this were anything but real life, but instead a cartoon. I could imagine flames and smoke to be erupting from his nostrils right about now. "Please elaborate, Lord Ping," Vanavan responded, taking the bait.
"She speaks of the usage of mana, the practice of magic, as if it were a savage's tool. Am I mistaken to assume that it is education, and the formalization of the process of studying, interpreting, and categorizing one's actions, and the manipulation of mana, that separates a civilized being from an uncivilized savage? That it is these very institutions we construct, develop, and uphold against the unfeeling forces of the natural order that enshrines what it means to be a sapient?"
"You are not mistaken, Lord Ping," Vanavan once more nodded, his calm demeanor acting as yet more kindling to the fire that was Ping's growing vitriol.
"Then how is the New Realmer's answer at all viable to your question, Professor Vanavan?"
"Semantics, Lord Ping," Vanavan responded calmly, prompting Oris to all but stop in his tracks.
"I beg your pardon?"
It was around this point that I saw Quiv's reptilian eyes practically lighting up at that response, like a shark smelling blood in the water. He raised his hand, poised for a killing blow. A blow Vanavan seemed to be glad to permit with a nod of his head. "If Professor Vanavan had phrased the question as such, is education a prerequisite for the practice of magic, then you would have been correct in dismissing the New Realmer's answer. However, not once did he say practice, instead explicitly referring to the use of magic, which in and of itself is an important descriptor. Because, as you phrase so eloquently yourself, it is the practice of magic that separates the savage from the civilized." Quiv managed out in one smooth practice motion, quickly handing the floor back to Vanavan with a deep bow of his head, leaving the bull stunned and dazed. "Thank you, Lord Ratom," Vanavan acknowledged, before pressing onwards by setting his sights not just on Oris, but on the rest of the crowd as well. "Lord Ping raises valid concerns, but once again, those concerns are predicated on a gross oversight of semantics, and a fundamental misunderstanding between the important delineating words, use and practice. Lord Ratom is thus correct in his assertions. Moreover, it is Lord Ratom's assertions that reinforces Cadet Booker's answer. For magic is indeed capable of being used by any being with a sufficiently mature manafield. The practice of magic, however, is an entirely different story altogether. For the practice of magic is entirely contingent on the formalized study of magic within the walls of academia, overseen by those accredited by institutions hallowed by the sacrosanct will of sapiency. Using magic, in and of itself, is fundamentally distinct from this, for it is a trait shared by many things, from the lowest of magical creatures such as the Lukhard slime, to the rare few gifted peasants prior to their induction into the magical guilds, to those new realms that have yet to have been endowed with the expectant principles of civility. Using magic is simply the manipulation of mana without civilized intent. Using magic is, as Cadet Booker so eloquently described, the senseless, meaningless, and purposeless manipulation of a natural force to reach a desired end. Practicing magic is, by contrast, the act of applying reason and purpose, the gifts of sapiency, in the manipulation of mana. In essence, civilizing what would otherwise be an uncivilized action. Vanavan concluded, in a way that felt eerily natural to him, as if he'd been practicing this speech, rehearsing these very words, time and time again. That, or he well and truly did believe in the veracity and the logic behind what felt like a highly biased interpretation of what would have otherwise been an objective study like science. Overall, this entire narrative just felt wrong. But it was clear that the man was only just beginning, as he finally transitioned away from that by virtue of the Lizard Gorn's re-entry into the conversation, for a raising of his hand. In effect, applying the expectant principles of civility unto those which are our God's given gifts of mana manipulation in order to enforce our will to shape the world as we see fit.
That is correct, Lord Ratum, Vanavan acknowledged with a nod, which is precisely why I posed this question to the class, to determine just how many among us truly understands this concept, this distinction between use and practice, to reinforce the importance that formal institutions of learning have had in allowing us to climb to such heights, and to allow you, as aspiring leaders amongst your realms, to enforce your will upon the world. The man paused, now transitioning into a sort of a motivational, almost inspirational tone of voice you'd expect from one of those cheesy late 2990s school dramedies. Which is exactly the reason why all of you are here. To learn, and to fulfill your obligations as models and beacons of the civilized world. A single hand was confidently raised once more by the lizard gorn in question, as Vanavan seemed all too pleased to grant him the floor yet again.
Which does lead me to one question, if I may, Professor.
Yes, Lord Ratum.
You mentioned new realms in your list of those who use, instead of those who practice magic.
That is correct, Lord Ratum.
And yet you cited the new realm's words as being, and I quote, categorically accurate. Moreover, you've utilized my own words to reaffirm the new realm's answer. If I may be so bold to ask, wouldn't that defy the veracity of your statements regarding new realms, Professor Vanavan? That because they have yet to be enlightened by the Nexus, that they are lumped in with groups that simply use magic, and thus undeniably savage? The man did a complete roundabout offensive, having jumped on the Oris Ping beatdown bandwagon, and having now redirected that momentum back towards me.
I am afraid, Lord Ratum, that this is a point of contention best reserved for those who are experts in the field or which your inquiries lie, social studies. I can only point out the truth and objective facts which I observe, and the realities which I know to be true. The eternal truths do state that new realms are considered savage by nature, as a result of their unlearned use of magic. However, that does not mean that Cadet Booker's response is invalidated. She has clearly answered the question correctly, thus creating a dissonance that can more than likely be explained by a mind more experienced and studied in a field beyond my own expertise.
If I may, Professor,
another voice peeped out. A higher-pitched one, tempered by a skittishness that coloured his voice. The ferret merchant lord. Yes, Lord Itholin Isilla.
The eternal truths are, in fact, something to be strived for by all civilized sapiens, correct?
That is correct.
Perhaps some new realms exist that innately understand these truths. These are, after all, universal constants that cannot be invalidated. It is perhaps such that this new realm is just closer to enlightenment without knowing it.
That is a possibility, Lord Asilla. But I can only postulate, as once again this is a question beyond the scope of this class, best reserved for social studies, and I would be remiss if I were to veer too far into Professor Articor's domain. The man more or less deflected that question with a polite smile, throwing the Fox Professor under the bus, and just as quickly shifting gears. Now then, with those important fundamentals out of the way, it is clear to me that this year group has quite a fair share of fundamentals that may require remediation. His words seemed to elicit some looks of incredulity, as egos are being damaged across the board. But of course, that is why my classes exist, to ensure that all of us are on the same page by year's end. Now, onto the structural details of the class. The man turned to the blackboard, which now seemed to be animated, with sticks of chalk running across the board in record speed. My classes, as with most of the other classes you will be taking, will be divided into two main periods. A morning period assigned to magic theory, and an afternoon period assigned to manafield studies. Other professors may have two subjects divided similarly, others, such as Professor Belnor, having 3 classes in a single day, whilst others still may have just one, such as Professor Chiska's physical education class. Polite groans were heard throughout the room at the very idea of physical education, but it soon quietened down after a firm shushing by Quiv. In the case of magic theory and manafield studies, we will be teaching both as if they were one class, because as I stated earlier, the two concepts are intertwined. Tests and examinations will be a combination of theory and practice, though I doubt any of you will have issues with this. Any questions so far? No hands were raised, prompting a wide smile to form on the man's face. Good. Now, on to the specifics of grading, the man continued with a polite smile, as more and more of the board was starting to fill up with charts, tables, and graphs, all describing and overcomplicating what was in effect a rather simple and straightforward grading system. A system that was divided into class participation, in-class assessments, homework, as well as the real heavy hitters, tests and exams, with the former being something done bi-monthly, covering things topic by topic, and the latter being administered bi-yearly, as a midterm and final exam. The explanations carried on into the weighting of the exams, which owing to the class being heavy on theory and light on practical studies, meant that most of the examinations would be paper exams, as opposed to the practical application of theory, a huge relief on my part. A mysterious group project was also hinted at, although given the vague phrasing, it felt as if it was something of an extra credit thing to be applied if the class underperformed following the midterms. It is better that this project remain elusive and be unaddressed until fate, or your performance, forces my hand. More questions were had, and follow-up answers were bombarded with even more follow-up questions, as my internal clock ticked away until finally the clock struck noon. And in the most Nexian way imaginable. And for the first time, I was treated to the school's bell system, marking the end of the class period with what could only be described as the over-the-top entrance of a literal marching band. Live music dominated by the clash of cymbals echoed throughout the room, and was capped off minutes later by the tink, tink, tink of triangles that seemed to faze literally nobody else but me. As I stared at the whole 3-minute affair with wide eyes and a baffled expression that, for better or for worse, was hidden beneath my expressionless helmet. A deep bow from the assorted musicians marked the end of that whole episode, as they simply walked off stage through a dedicated door that had formed to the tune of a mana radiation warning. We shall continue after lunch. As for now, this first class is dismissed. Quiv led the way out, despite being sat at the very front of class, with the rest of his group consisting of the bear-like Orvan Croven, the bat-like Aerit, and the hamster-like Mofus trailing behind him. But instead of the whole room filing out in an orderly fashion, no one else seemed to follow. That was until a stern punch to my shoulder by Thalmin, and a sharp glare by Thacia clued me in to the social decorum that was to be expected from me. Order of departure is sorted by points accrued, read a note that Thacia passed to me, as I nodded and began filing out as soon as I'd read that note. Following that, the whole room erupted into a surprisingly orderly free-for-all, or at least as far as I could tell, as the view from my rear-view cameras went out of frame. The Grand Dining Hall. Local time, 12:10. Emma. There seemed to at least be even more universal truths that managed to cross over through time and space, despite the distances involved. Because, as I saw it, the lunch rush was as alive as ever, even here in the Academy of all places. Though it didn't manifest itself in the same way as it did over Earthside. Because instead of the diners of the Grand Dining Hall being prompted to scurry from buffet station to buffet station, or kiosk to kiosk, it was instead the servers, who were busy scurrying around with banquets worth of dishes, perched precariously upon entire dining room table-length trolleys. The whole scene was as chaotic as it was magical, as the same elven servers and members of other species from the other breakfast rushes struggled to keep up with the growing demands of the students. Though the faculty, staff and their apprentices seemed to at least be spared from the hectic back and forth,
as they sat there on their elevated platforms, above all of the hustle and bustle of the normal dining floor. Interestingly enough, the same elf from our first breakfast was the one to wait at our table. And funnily enough, it was Thalmin who spoke first, once again, not even waiting for the poor elf to finish his greetings.
"Anything on the menu with meat, and second servings too," he barked out, prompting the server to glance towards the rest of the group, each of whom gave their own answers in short order.
"Something light but colourful," Thacia requested, in a way that felt as flighty as it was unnecessarily vague.
"Your finest offerings, now,"
Eleanor followed suit, in that same smug demeanour he always wore. The elf's gaze eventually landed on me, which, given my predispositions, forced me to simply give him the same answer I gave a few days prior. "Nothing, thank you. Just have whatever the meal of the day is delivered to my room. Thanks," I managed out, prompting the elf to simply scurry off shortly thereafter. A mana radiation warning, courtesy of the Eevee's warnings folder, suddenly dinged, indicating that a potential cone of silence had been formed around our table, courtesy of either Thacia, Thalmin, or even Eleanor. "Emma, we need to discuss what just happened," Thacia began, as she leaned in close, prompting the other two, and even me, despite not necessarily needing to do the same. "I know, Thacia, I know. I'm sorry about almost messing up the whole classroom leaving order. I didn't know that the points thing meant... That wasn't the topic I wanted to raise," Thacia interjected with a sigh. "Our warnings were enough to have you leave without violating decorum. No, the topic I wish to address is your unwitting participation in what is clearly becoming a race for class standing." "Oh, carry on then." "Through no fault of your own, but through a combination of your decisions and factors outside of your control and your responses to them, you are quickly cementing yourself as a contender in the race for class standing. You have noticed how Lord Quiv, from the onset of orientation, has consistently offered himself up to the Academy's whims, correct?" "Yeah, he's a textbook example of a teacher's pet," I acknowledged. The translation to which seemed to spark some sort of a reaction in the gang, as they all reacted to it in their own unique ways, with Thacia in particular narrowing her eyes at that response. "That is true, Emma," was the extent of her verbal acknowledgement at that before carrying on. "Individuals such as Lord Quiv are to be expected from any year group, and nominally they would be at worst a neutral party and at best a helpful asset. But it is when one openly challenges such a person that they become socially belligerent." Thacia spoke carefully, choosing each and every one of her words carefully. "Such as with Oris Ping, the bull," I offered. "When I arrived back after the explosion, he was trying to rally people to his side, trying to dismiss Quiv's whole narrative by planting his own. I'm assuming that's what a direct challenge is like." "Yes," Thacia nodded. "Not the most elegant of examples, but given his abrasive character, I expect no less from him. Which would explain exactly why Quiv is going for takedown mode on him in class, even siding with me of all people in order to double down on Oris Ping's complete social smackdown in front of the whole year group." "Correct, Emma," Thacia acknowledged with yet another nod. "But as you quickly experienced shortly thereafter, the man just as quickly redirected the momentum of that smackdown, as you put it, back towards you. But thanks to Vanavan's lack of a backbone and the fact he deferred Quiv's question entirely, that never really worked out." "Precisely." "Right." I let out a small sigh, just as the gang's food arrived. "And I'm assuming Quiv is going to try to get back at me for having not managed to knock me down a peg?" "Not necessarily, Emma," Thacia reasoned, pausing for just a moment to sample what appeared to be a multicoloured muesli. "There's a fine line between going after an objective, following a perceived social slight, and simply ignoring them following the fact, as going after it may be perceived as to be stooping down to a level beneath your own station." The Avenor paused, before quickly moving on to another point. "Not that I mean to say you are beneath him, of course, Emma, merely that, in accordance to decorum, you might seem to be through his perspective. I get it, Thacia, no offense taken, I managed out for a forced smile. There is another social slight you are also overlooking at this point, Emma, Thacia continued. You mean when I managed to inadvertently step on his toes when we went back and forth, insisting that the other gets first pick of the seats? Yes. But wasn't that resolved by Vanavan? It wasn't about the bickering itself, Emma, nor the fact both of you stepped up concurrently. It was the choice of seat you chose. What? You see, by stepping up concurrently, the perceived social expectation is that the choice you make will be the same as that of your opponent. Therefore, by choosing the middle seat, you are indirectly inferring that that was the seat Lord Quiv Raton was intending to choose, thus inferring that he wouldn't have chosen the most coveted of seats, the front row seats. I took a moment to regard this with a hefty sigh, sinking back into my armor with a dazed expression. Seriously? Was all I could manage out at this point. Seriously, Emma, Thacia responded with a nod. This is known as the tie-maker's statement, or the concurrent gambit, if you're more old-fashioned. This is just way too much, Thacia, like, unnecessarily so. That may be true, but it is but an aspect of the social games we play. And I'm going to assume this is just a small taste of what you've been playing over in Aetheron Realm? Thacia paused, leaving her spoon hanging precariously over the edge of the dish, before nodding deeply. That is correct, Emma. This has been my life from the onset of my first memories. You have my deepest sympathies, then. Grand Concourse of Learning, Betrayans Hall, local time 1400. Lunch took over an hour. The preamble to class, consisting of even more word soup, took another. We were nearly a third of the way in before things finally picked up, and that sweet, sweet intel started to flow. Starting with what seemed to be the most obvious pointers, stemming from our previous discussions being written on the blackboard behind us. What is magic? Magic is the instinctive and/or purposeful manipulation and application of mana in the accomplishment of a given end. The use of magic is seen through instinctive and/or the arbitrary application of mana to achieve a given end. The practice of magic is seen through the learned and theory-based approach of purposefully manipulating mana toward a given end, allowing for more complex and advanced forms of magic to be created from the mind of the sapient. How does one use and practice magic, and how does one manipulate magic? This next question, unlike the first, was left blank on the blackboard, which meant exactly what I feared. Another question and answer routine. This time, however, I was thankfully spared, as several more students were chosen either at random or at their insistence, with none other than Quiv and Oris being the two who competed for classroom dominance. By manipulating mana streams, through the direction and redirection of mana streams through the soul. By channeling latent mana through one's mana fields, thereby controlling its output, changing its properties, and imbuing it with one's will. Student after student spoke, prompting Vanavan to finally consolidate all the answers into a simple, straightforward response on the blackboard. The use and practice of magic, irrespective of instinct or learned intent, is accomplished through the channeling and manipulation of latent or stored mana, facilitated by a mature manafield. The blackboard behind the man transcribed his words live, giving it an almost surreal experience, as the various pieces of chalk scrambled to match the man's pace. Which leads me to my next point. What is a manafield? What is a manafield? Several answers were thrown about amongst the crowd. Minutes bled into a quarter, then half an hour, before a proper answer was finally drawn up on the board, after a full hour had passed. A manafield is simply an extension of one's soul. It is a barrier for some, and an appendage for others. In essence, it is what defines a living being, for all living beings must possess a manafield. Whether mature or immature, a manafield is required for the processes of life. For those blessed with the gifts of mana manipulation, born with a mature manafield, it is an appendage by which to manipulate mana. For those born without the gift, born with an immature manafield, it is but a barrier by which one resists the deleterious effects of mana. A membrane by which one siphons just enough for the processes of life. Any questions? I raised my hand almost immediately. Yes, Cadet Emma Booker. So, by that definition, can a living being exist without a manafield?